Okay, so this talk got pushed back a couple times, and I know I've been here for a while, but I think it's a good time to give the talk. I'm wrapping up some projects and starting new ones, so hopefully maybe there will be some interesting things that we can talk about for new collaborations from this. So today I'm going to talk about plant traits and the importance of competition among individuals, and I want to start out with some sort of charismatic examples of that. So here's a tree growing in an ordinary forest in Illinois. This guy's really sort of risking the integrity of his trunk, growing at about a 45-degree angle to try to get some of these branches into sun. Here's another example where we have a walking palm. It's putting down roots on one side of the trunk and picking up roots from the other side, very slowly sort of walking to better environments. Here's a liana, and these guys are really sort of cheating their way to the top. All the other trees around them are investing in strong, sturdy stems to hold up their own canopies, while they're clambering on top of all that structure to put their leaves on top of the other trees. And then finally is the strangler fig, who sort of bribes a bird with a bit of fruit to take its seed and hopefully drop it off the top of a canopy tree where it can start growing in full sun, and eventually at its leisure grow these roots down to the bottom to start collecting its own water and nutrients. So I think these strategies are interesting because if you think about it, it took a seed from a liana or a strangler fig and put it in an open field. All these cool strategies of clambering on top of other individuals wouldn't pay off at all. It's really the interactions among competition and interactions with other individuals that drive some of these important strategies. Okay, so now I'm going to jump to why I think this work that I'm going to tell you about today is important. So it looks like we're emitting, so we all know we're emitting CO2 into the atmosphere through fossil fuel emissions and land use change, but it looks like just 44% of that carbon stays in the atmosphere, acts as a greenhouse gas, and warms the planet. The terrestrial biosphere and the ocean are taking up 29% and 26% of that carbon respectively, really doing us a favor in buffering the amount of CO2 that we've been adding into the atmosphere. But what's a little worrying is that both climate modelers and ecologists alike aren't sure whether or not we'll be able to continue to count on this 29% from the terrestrial biosphere in particular in the future. And I just want to show you a little example of that. So here, these are these Earth system models. They're used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to predict the pace of climate change in the world. And so we can look at these models all run with the same emission scenario and compare their outputs. And here we're looking at the contribution of the land to the global carbon cycle. So positive numbers are the land acting as a carbon sink, and negative numbers are the land acting as a source of carbon to the atmosphere. So you can see throughout the historical range, these models agree fairly well, and they're all predicting this slightly strong carbon sink here. But then when they're used to predict into the future, the range of these predictions start to diverge quite rapidly. Whereas some models are predicting a very strong carbon sink, and others are predicting the terrestrial biosphere to turn all the way around and become a source of carbon to the atmosphere. Now what's interesting, not only is this range and uncertainty in our predictions, but this pattern of prediction, where we have agreement throughout the historical range and then an explosion when we use to predict into the future, is really sort of a signature of models that you could use a more solid mechanistic basis. Okay, so why is this so hard? I think it's so hard also because the same reasons why I think it's super interesting. So if we think about plants and other systems in biology, there's really interesting feedbacks and important interactions across scales. So if we want to know something at the landscape scale, like an ecosystem service like carbon storage, to understand it, we might want to start back at the very beginning. So leaves do photosynthesis and fix carbon, pulling it out of the atmosphere. But then to scale up to an individual, we've got to think about subtracting off respiration of that individual and how the individuals are allocating carbon to these different components. Then to scale up to the population level, we've got to think about how individuals are sharing resources or competing for those resources. And then to get up to a landscape scale, again, we've got to think about landscape level heterogeneity, maybe some source sink dynamics and things like that. So studying these scale transitions is difficult. It can be hard to do experiments and observations across all of these scales. And this brings an opportunity for theory to really come in and make a contribution and do these scale transitions and make predictions about data that we can collect. But those models aren't magic. Of course, they have their own problems. So we can make really complex individual-based simulation models. These can often be very data limited, and their results can sometimes be as difficult to understand as the real world itself. On the other hand, if we make very simple models, these can produce paradoxical results. So I try to walk this fine line in between, where I make models that have the critical mechanisms involved, but they're simple enough to understand. Okay. So my working approach right now for understanding trait distributions across different environmental gradients is to focus on a particular functional trait and then build a mathematical model that makes these critical scale transitions that are important in determining that trait. Hopefully I can make some analytical, mathematical predictions, and from this clearly see the dependence of the results on the environment, model mechanisms, and the parameter values that go into it. And I wanted to emphasize that throughout, doing this isn't easy, and throughout I'm comparing with data, relaxing the simplifications that I had to make the analytical model, simulating and seeing how this all goes about. Okay, so today we're going to talk about allocation strategies of that functional trait, mainly allocations of trees to leaves, woody biomass, and fine roots. And the big questions that we will be looking at, so first is a basic science question. So how does competition for light, water, and nutrients influence dominant plant allocation strategies? And I'll also be talking on an applied question of how does this competitive allocation influence carbon sinks? Okay. So a little outline for the talk. So I'm going to walk you through, give you a little feel for this model that I've been working with, and then we'll look at, we'll use it to explain some empirical phenomena. So first we'll look at the main allocation trade-off in forests, and then we'll look at complex plant responses to simple resource addition experiments. And then I'll touch on these applications to the global carbon cycle, and at the end, hopefully I'll talk about current and future work. Okay, so we're going to start with this mechanistic yet tractable model of tree allocation strategies. And so it's pretty simple. Like I said, we're sort of abstracting and making a simple model. So here, individuals are made out of leaves, woody biomass, and fine roots. Those fine roots are used to take up nitrogen and build leaves, where each unit of leaf biomass costs the plant the same amount of nitrogen. Those leaves take up light and do photosynthesis, but the amount of light per leaf layer decreases through the crown because of self-shading. Excuse me. Okay. Then plants, those fine roots are also used to take up water. If they have enough water, they can do photosynthesis in proportion to the amount of light they have. But if not, then they'll just do photosynthesis in proportion to the amount of water because of this exchange at the level of stomata between CO2 and water. So here we're assuming a constant exchange rate, a constant water use efficiency at the leaf level. Yeah. Sort of, yeah. Well, it is sort of linear, except up to a maximum. That's the model I'm using. So so Farquhar is a asymptote, right? But we just take that as 2 points for now. That's one of the things that makes it analytically tractable, but you can relax when you go to simulations. Okay, so for the whole plant, what does that mean? So the more nitrogen you take up, the more photosynthesis you can do, but there's diminishing marginal returns because those additional leaf layers are more and more shaded. With water uptake, on the other hand, when you're water limited, the more water you take up, proportionally more photosynthesis you can do because of this constant exchange rate between CO2 and water. Okay. So throughout this talk, I think it'll be helpful to think about nitrogen as being building the engines of photosynthesis, these leaves, whereas water being more of like a fuel of photosynthesis. Okay, so the environmental inputs are pretty simple. We take light level to be constant, nitrogen mineralization rate to be constant, but then soil moisture, it turns out we need a more complex model. And so here I've done a full hydrologic model with stochastic rainfall, but the upshot of that work is that today all we really need to think about for what plants care about is this sort of simplified rainfall regime, where we have the proportion of time that plants spend in water limitation when they're competing for water, and second, the average amount of water that they have while water limited. Okay, so now we can start putting these individuals together and think about their competition for resources. So when plants are limited by nitrogen and water, they're pretty good at taking it up. And here we just assume that they can take it all up. So it doesn't matter if they're sparsely rooted or densely rooted, they take up the same amount of nitrogen, build the same number of leaves, and take up the same amount of water and do the same amount of water-limited photosynthesis. But if an individual comes in with a different strategy, say you have more fine roots than your neighbors, you'll be able to take up more than your fair share of that nitrogen, build more leaves, and take up more than your fair share of water and do more water-limited photosynthesis. And the alternative is true if you have fewer fine roots than your neighbors. Okay. With these forest dynamics models, one of the trickiest things is always figuring out how much light goes to an individual. And so for a long time, we were working with these individual-based models where we sort of discretize space and think about all the overlap between individuals. But at the end of the day, these forests don't look very much like a natural forest. There's all this sort of space going on. And in reality, we know that, so these individuals are growing straight up. In reality, we know that individuals can grow and move their crowns to more favorable habitats quite easily. So I've been working with this model that's based on that idea. So we take the notion that individuals are good at foraging horizontally for light and take it to the extreme. And so that means that all of the tallest individuals whose crowns can fit in the canopy are in the canopy, and the rest of the individuals are in the understory. So that is, at the end of the day, now we don't have to worry about where individuals are anymore. We just need to remember their size. And so this model has been tested in different ways, parameterized with data from the forest inventory analysis, and seems to be working quite well. So here I'm using it. So this is the perfect plasticity approximation. And what's really nice is that for late successional forests, we have closed-form mathematical expressions for things like steady-state size structure and the expected lifetime reproductive success of an individual. And so I'll be using those. So we've been talking about individual properties. Here we're changing allocation strategies and resource availability. We're scaling through this population dynamics that's simple because of this PPA approximation. And then we get to stand-level properties like height of canopy closure and expected lifetime reproductive success. And now to use this model to predict dominant plant traits across space, we might want to ask what should be the competitive dominant strategy given this setup. So to do that, this is where game theory comes in and these adaptive dynamics analyses. So here I'm just going to try to explain that for a second. So we've got different plant traits and their fitness in the environment set by a resident individual. So here's a resident individual, and it's growing with an expected lifetime reproductive success of 1. So this is a late successional model where that individual is just replacing itself every lifetime. Okay, so but it wouldn't be the competitive dominant because there are all these other plant individuals with different traits that could come in and have more than replace themselves in that environment. Excuse me. So we need to sort of play this game with different residents until we find one that can't be invaded by any other potential invader. And that resident then is a competitive dominant or evolutionarily stable strategy that we should expect to see in nature. Okay. So now I want to start to look at some results. So we'll look at the main allocation trade-off in forests. I want to motivate with some real data first. So these are forests across the globe, and this is data put together from the FluxNet data set. And so they looked at a lot of things, but they took stand-level allocation to leaves, woody biomass, and fine roots. We can look for trade-offs in those allocation strategies. So here, with foliage versus fine roots, it looks like there's not a big trade-off there. Wood versus foliage, also we don't see a large trade-off. But with wood versus fine roots, it looks like that's the dominant trade-off axis that's going on in these forests. And that's interesting for a couple of reasons. So in ecological theory, we have a lot to say about root versus shoot allocation. So that's trade-offs below ground versus above ground. But we're really not seeing that here between foliage and fine roots. We're only seeing it between wood and fine roots. And that's a big deal for carbon storage because if we move across this axis and don't have any change in the total productivity of the sites, but just moving along that axis because of the differences in residence times of carbon in those different tissues, long-lived wood versus short-lived fine roots, this is a big change in carbon storage. Okay, so it seems like something that should be, we should understand. And I just wanted to throw in some of my own data here. So these are 22 forests across from Iowa to West Virginia. So, I should say, so this data was taken, of course, by several different groups of individuals, and I was interested in this data for a number of reasons, but one of which that we can do is that a group of us took this data on leaves, woody biomass, and fine roots, and we can compare that as well. Okay, so it looks like in this data set as well, we get the dominant trade-off axis being between wood and fine roots. Okay. So still working on it. I mean, yeah, so that's why. So I set this up to get a rainfall regime gradient, but there are a lot of things changing among the plots, so I'm still sort of parsing that out. Got some good ideas about it at a conference last week, but I'm still working on it. Okay, so we want to understand this allocation trade-off that's happening in the data. So let's go back to that model. Here is one of these competitive dominant ESS allocation strategies, and I want to explain this one for nitrogen-limited plants and fine roots in particular. So it's a little bit complicated, but I think it's worth it. So here we've got these little cartoons of trees again. We've got their leaves, woody biomass, and fine roots. And I'm pulling out those leaves here where we have the most productive leaf in full sun, and then decreasing levels of productivity of those leaves because of shading within the plant, indicated in the yellow. And then the root cost per leaf is equal for each leaf because they're nitrogen limited. Each leaf has the same amount of, costs the plant the same amount of nitrogen. The ESS turns out to be this one where the root cost per leaf is equal to the productivity of the least productive leaf. So now why is that? If you imagine invading a resident of this strategy with somebody who has more roots, you would get to build more leaves, but those leaves wouldn't pay off because they're even more shaded than those last leaves. So the roots cost more than the payoff there. Alternatively, if you came in with fewer fine roots, you'd be missing out on some of these carbon-positive leaves. So at the end of the day, it looks like competitive nitrogen-limited plants invest in fine roots at a level that cancels the productivity of the least productive leaf. It's interesting when we think about that competitive dominant in comparison to one that's the fastest growing strategy in monoculture, so something maybe more like the engineering optimum. So these guys would have, or agricultural optimum, so these guys would have just enough fine roots to pick up the nitrogen and build those leaves. But that amount of fine roots doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the productivity of the least productive leaf. So if that competitive investment is greater, then we should see communities shift towards this allocation strategy. And I've been calling that increase in fine roots a competitive overinvestment. So what do I mean by that? In particular, I mean an investment made by an individual that enhances their competitive ability, but that decreases their own growth rate when that strategy is in monoculture. And so woody biomass is an example of this, as plants are competing for light, growing out of the shade of one another, and getting ever more taller and taller. We just saw that fine roots is a competitive overinvestment when plants are competing for nitrogen. I'll tell you that it also is for water. But leaves, on the other hand, are a little bit more territorial. So when plants are moving their crowns to get more light, it looks like they're shading themselves much more than they're shading other individuals in the canopy. So this doesn't have that competitive overinvestment driver. Okay. So now when we look across resource gradients, so here, nitrogen availability on the x-axis, we get these intuitive predictions. So plants should increase allocation to leaves, increase allocation to woody biomass, and decrease fine roots. But the bulk of the travel here is in wood and fine roots, these axes of competitive overinvestments by plants. And now we can put that on this allocation strategy space again. So these are greater and greater nitrogen availability, and we can compare with the data. We see that maybe we're capturing this main axis of variation in the data. We can make another comparison. So here's total productivity, leaves, woody biomass, and fine roots. You see that, okay, we're doing an okay job with leaves and woody biomass. But with fine roots, we're really missing this phenomenon of an increase in fine roots with total productivity that's happening in the data. Excuse me. Okay, so now we can switch to stop thinking about nitrogen limitation and think about plants have all the nitrogen they want. Now they're limited by water. So to think about the ESS there, we've got to remember that water is a fuel of photosynthesis and gives these constant returns when limiting. Here the competitive dominant, or ESS fine root allocation then, is the one that doesn't just cancel the productivity of the least productive leaf, but cancels the productivity of all leaves during water-limited periods. And so we can look across resource gradients again. With more time in water saturation, time when plants aren't competing for water, again, we get these intuitive predictions. So an increase in leaf biomass, an increase in woody biomass, and a decrease in fine root biomass. But the bulk of the travel here is in wood and fine roots, these competitive overinvestments. Alternatively, with more water, when you're water limited, when you're competing for it, this has this interesting effect of not helping the plants out at all in terms of their leaves or woody biomass, but just increasing the amount of fine roots that they have to put down to engage in competition for that water. Okay. So now with two axes, we have a full envelope of two axes of water availability. We have an envelope of predictions for the model. We can again compare to that FluxNet data set, excuse me. And we see that it looks like we're capturing a bit more of the spread in the model in the data, excuse me. And I should say that these closed circles are for temperate deciduous forests, which the model was parameterized for, whereas the open circles are for all other forests in the data set. We can, again, make those other comparisons. So here's total productivity, leaves, woody biomass, and fine roots. We said that with leaves, maybe we're missing some of these, missing some interesting stuff here at high productivity. And I think that's probably likely driven by excuse me, some interesting feedbacks with cool leaf traits that might become important at high productivity. With woody biomass, we're doing a good job. And with fine roots, now with this water limitation, we're now able to capture and potentially explain the increase in fine roots with total productivity. Okay. So to summarize that section, it looks like the main allocation trade-off, both in the data and in the model, is between wood and fine roots, and that's really driven by these competitive overinvestments of plants. So allocation to wood or high carbon storage is really favored in high nitrogen and when plants have less time and water limitation. And I just wanted to note that the differences in the responses of plants to nitrogen and water addition when those are limiting are driven by these differences in the utility of those resources to the plants. So nitrogen acting as a fuel, whereas water acting as, nitrogen acting as an engine of photosynthesis, but water acting as a fuel. Okay. So now I want to shift from thinking about this observational data set and comparisons with the full range of predictions to try to understand some experimental results. Okay. So to do that, I want to go back and think about current resource limitation theory. There's lots of ideas out there, but they're all sort of based in these very two intuitive models. The first of which is Liebig's law of the minimum. So this is the idea that it's unlikely that an environment would be supplying resources at exactly the proportions that plants need. And so there should always be one resource that's most limiting. This has the implication that if you add resources to plants, they should only respond to that most limiting resource. But eventually ecologists came on the scene and said, well, but plants can respond to their environment. And they would be wasting any investment in taking up resources that aren't limiting to them. So they should always be working towards co-limitation by all these resources. And this has the alternative prediction of if you add resources, they should always decrease investment and uptake of that resource. Okay, so these are very different predictions. It seems like an optimal case for experiments to come in and sort of settle the debate. But all these years later, experiments are still confusing. We have these complex responses, and we don't really understand what's going on. So I looked into that as well, and again, also got some complex responses. So here I've got a resource addition experiment with 36 plots planted in 1994 with 32 species each, so these are diverse prairie plots. And then for 4 years before I sampled, they had 3 levels of nitrogen treatments crossed with 2 levels of water treatments. And I came in 2010 and sampled. I was interested in above and below ground biomass. I was careful to pull out the leaf biomass and the fine root biomass, these resource gathering structures. Okay. So we can look at those results. So we get some intuitive things. So there's an increase in leaf biomass with nitrogen. And in the watered plots, there's a significant decrease in roots with added nitrogen. Oh, I should tell you what these axes are. So I've got nitrogen treatments here, 0, 7, and 14 grams of nitrogen per meter squared per year. And then ambient plots and added water plots in blue. Okay, so all 6 treatments there. Okay, so the results, so we get nitrogen, leaves increase with nitrogen, and then in the watered plots, fine roots are decreasing with nitrogen. And then we get these sort of strange results, where for at low nitrogen, added water creates this big increase in fine root biomass, but that effect goes away at high nitrogen. So it's really sort of strange to think about at high nitrogen, it looks like plants aren't limited by water there at all. So what's going on? So we went back to that allocation strategy and limitation in plants model, modified it for prairies, and then made some predictions for plants that are limited by both water and nitrogen. So in those model predictions, we have the prediction that leaves should increase with nitrogen. That makes sense. Roots should decrease with nitrogen. We see that in those watered plots. And then this interesting prediction that the effect of water on roots should decrease with nitrogen. So that, interestingly enough, it seems like that's happening. So this effect, whatever it is, of water on roots, here it's positive, is turning around and decreasing with nitrogen. Said another way, the effect of nitrogen on roots should be greater with higher water. And so that's also happening. Only in the watered plots do we get these significant decreases with nitrogen. Okay, so why is that going on? Well, it looks like the competitive dominant, or ESS, fine root investment for plants when they're limited by both nitrogen and water is a weighted average between this water-limited and nitrogen-limited ESS that I've been talking about in separation before. And so here we get really an explicit interaction term between water and nitrogen, maybe causing a lot of these interesting interactions going on in simple resource addition experiments. And so it really says that when we add water, we're doing 2 things. We're changing this water ESS, but we're also changing the weight onto the nitrogen ESS there. And so the importance of the nitrogen strategy increases with water additions, and then also that the effect of water additions, so whatever it is, you're changing this and moving there, whatever that does should decrease with nitrogen because that nitrogen ESS is decreasing with nitrogen. Okay, so all in all, it looks like plants are effectively sequentially limited by water and nitrogen, making their competitive allocation influenced by both. And I sort of like this resolution because it goes back to these intuitive models of resource limitation. It just says that they're acting over different time scales. Okay, so now I just wanted to briefly touch on some work that we've been doing to include these competitive allocation strategies in global carbon cycle models. So, but first, just in the carbon sink problem in general. So here what we've been doing is adding CO2 to the plants and looking at how that interacts with nitrogen limitation and competitive allocation strategies. So this is a recent paper by Ray Jabczynski. And here we saw that with added CO2, even with all of the nitrogen limitation interactions that are going on, at the end of the day, the plants do allocate more to woody biomass, this carbon-rich tissue, and provide a carbon sink. Oops, did I just shut this off? Oops. Okay, so I've got then I have a paper right now in review where we're looking at water limitation and these responses to added CO2. So to do that was a little bit more complicated. I needed to look at how CO2 changes both of these axes, abstract axes of water availability, time and water saturation, the amount of water that they have when they're water limited. So with that, I started working with Ignacio Rodriguez Iturbe, who had a great model of soil moisture as it's dependent on stochastic storms. And here, but inside of that, I needed to put the allocation strategies of plants. So, so I did that work, and then we've got some predictions for changes, factor of increase in carbon storage with rainfall here. So here's rainfall and then the frequency at which that rainfall arrives in different storm events. And there you can see there's these interesting, very, very nonlinear patterns of increases in storage at low water availability. Yeah, this stopped working. Okay. So with that understanding, we've also been putting these competitive allocation strategies in an Earth system model. So this is work in collaboration with Enqing Wang and others at NOAA's Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory. So we've been moving from an old model with just one big leaf on a tree to one where we have cohorts of individuals and try to use our understanding of allocation strategies as the drivers of investment of trees in woody biomass, this critical component of carbon storage. And the next step is to really make this a fully coupled global model and try to figure out how big of an effect these responses are really having at the global scale, and whether or not everybody needs to do this level of complication. Okay, so to go back to the big questions, so I had this basic science question of how does competition for light, water, and nutrients influence dominant plant allocation strategies? I think the main story there is that there's competitive overinvestments can be a big deal, and they can drive, both in the data and in theory, the dominant axes of variation. And then we have this applied question of, is individual-based competition critical to predicting carbon sinks? I think it's likely to be because of these strong nonlinear interactions with water limitation. And so I'm really interested in pursuing this further and scaling up to the globe. Okay, so now it's time for some current and future work. We'll see how this goes. So I've been talking about just how much of different things plants build, just leaves, woody biomass, and fine roots. I'm also getting at some projects where we're looking at what type of those things they build. So understanding dominant plant hydraulic strategies is some work with Bill Andreg and Adam Wolf back at Princeton. And I'm also looking at microbial interactions with plants, thinking about a couple of different interesting hypotheses with CO2 fertilization, progressive nitrogen limitation versus priming in those interactions. I'm also starting to work on some root functional traits, which I'm really excited about. This is work in collaboration with Rich Norby, Colleen, and Jeff out at Oak Ridge. Okay. So, but on the bigger scale, I'm really interested in sort of broadening this approach. So I've been talking about building a mechanistic understanding of dominant plant strategies, and I want to start to include across environmental gradients, and I want to start to include the effect of successional timescales as well. So why do I want to do that? So disturbance events are rare, but it looks like they influence dominant plant strategies every day. So we can see dense wood or conservative hydrometry, drought resistance in plants, or whether or not they invest in wood might be things that can help them if a disturbance comes along, but that would cost them in terms of competition on a daily basis. So I'm really interested in how these different pressures interact to determine the dominant plant strategies. In particular, I'm interested in this question of that setup and whether it drives single dominance of a particular trait or a particular value, or coexistence of different strategies. So if you have coexistence of many strategies and they have different susceptibilities to disturbance, you can imagine that that ecosystem would be quite resilient to changes in disturbance regimes that might come along with climate change. But alternatively, it might be the case that competition is really pushing plants to the limit of the disturbance regime that they're evolved to, and these might be very sensitive to big changes. So this has major applications in the community's susceptibility to changes in disturbance regime, and then also biome distributions. So thinking about the shift from forests to savannas, where you have grass and trees coexisting, and then all the way to grasses themselves. So I've been talking about individual properties scaling through this simple population dynamics model getting to stand level properties. But to do what I just talked about, I really need to start getting in here and breaking up this population dynamics model and making that more rich, moving from this dense stand that's where competition is really important to an open stand where maybe other things are important. And I've been playing with this a little bit lately, and I was trying to think of an interesting thing to present. I'm not sure this counts, but I'll try anyway. So I've got species that have equivalent equilibrium stand structure, but they have a trade-off in growth and mortality. So here I've got mortality in the canopy versus growth in the canopy. And I've picked these points so that they, for the analytical model, when the plot area is infinite and you go all the way to the late successional stage, you get indefinite coexistence of all these strategies. However, if you start to go back from infinity, go to a very large plot, you still get a lot of coexistence, but there's a ranking among those species. So here I'm plotting crown area index. So here are the different species, and this one's like dominating. Crown area index is just how much crown area they have per unit area. And then here I'm plotting D star is the size of the smallest tree in the canopy. So you can see that all of a sudden the canopy closes, and those trees grow up very quickly, but then they start to die, and other trees replace them there. Okay. But when we make the plot area even smaller, so this is a more sort of reasonable forest, you can see that it matters whether or not you have high growth or high mortality, or low mortality, excuse me. So this blue guy is really dominating when we look at when individual tree mortality becomes important, when these stochastic events become important. But of course, if you put that guy in competition with one that should be the competitive dominant at the late successional stage, it will eventually come in and take over, and we get this successional dynamics. So I'm really interested in understanding these dynamics, these coexistence in different ways, and I'm interested now in sort of pinning these to specific traits, trying to understand them and use the biology to get at this problem more solidly. Okay. So with that, I'll finish and ask if you have any questions.